Hello and welcome to a special interview of the News Minute. I'm sure you've heard terms like wealth redistribution, inheritance tax being used in election campaign. These are seemingly complex economic terms. You've heard the Prime Minister and his cabinet even tell the electorate that if the Congress comes to power, then they'll use these economic tools to snatch away their wealth. But how true is this? But more importantly, what do these terms mean? My guest today is not just best equipped to explain these terms to us, but also to set the context. I'm being joined by Professor R Ramakumar, who teaches at the TIS and also is an economist. Thank you so much for joining us. But before I go across to him, as I keep asking you, a quick appeal from all of us. We have reporters who are bringing you voices from the ground, along with, of course, analysis and breaking news stories. Please make sure that you go and check out our joint election coverage between the News Minute and News Laundry. See what topic interests you and contribute accordingly. Because this way, you can support independent journalism and keep us going. I want to start by asking you what the Prime Minister and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman have been telling the people. Is it true that if inheritance tax and wealth tax is ever implemented by anybody, then middle class poor people will have to suffer and large parts of their wealth will be taken away by the government?
Pooja, I think it is very unfortunate that the present debate on inheritance tax or wealth tax has been completely, distorted by the Prime Minister and the members of his cabinet in ways which do not represent what an inheritance tax or wealth tax actually is or are. To begin with, it's very important to note, I think it has come out very clearly now, that many members of the BJP, including the former finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, former minister of finance, Minister of State for Finance, Jayant Sinha, and many other leaders of the Sangh Parivar had at one point or the other wanted the inheritance tax to be introduced in India to reduce the levels of inequality that we have. It is also true that members of the UPA, including the finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram of that time, had at one point of time requested the planning commission to examine this proposal in some detail. So that there are instances in the recent past where members of both sides of the political establishment have thought about this idea in reasonable ways. I think they've asked economists or Niti Aayog or the Planning Commission at some point of time to examine this proposal and so on. So that means they've thought about it, and it's not something that should not be thought about it at all. That is something like a sacrilege to think about. Number one. Number two, it is most important to note that nowhere in the world is inheritance tax or wealth tax charged on everybody in the population or even the middle class in the population. It is always a very small stratum at the top, sometimes the top 1%, or sometimes the top 10% max. That has never happened earlier, but only the top stratum of the society is essentially covered by inheritance tax or wealth tax. That is because inheritance tax is essentially charged on high value inheritances. Low value inheritances are completely exempted from the charging of an inheritance tax. Let us think about it in the Indian context. How can a middle class family be affected by an inheritance tax if inheritance tax is charged only for those inheritances above 10 crore rupees? Very few families, even in the middle class, will be even touched by that kind of a proposal because the average wealth holding in the top 1% in class in India is close to 4 crore rupees or 5 crore rupees. That is all. So, not even the top 1% is actually touched. It's only a very small percentage which have inheritances above a significant threshold, which will be ultimately affected by an inheritance tax. So, it is completely a canard to spread that the Mangal Sutra or the hard earned money of the middle class or the poor is being snatched away by this proposal in any form. The third important point is that there is a complete distortion being made in this sense also, that the money collected through inheritance tax is seen as a redistribution, which it is actually, but the Prime Minister has been arguing that it is going to be redistributed among a particular section of our society, which is religiously identified. he has given enough indications, and he has even named the community in one form or the other. He has said that those who are khuspetiyas, or those who have more children, and at some point he even said Musalmans. So it is very clear who he is referring to, and his attack on the UPA or the Congress or the India Alliance is essentially on the lines that these people are going to take the money of Hindus and giving it to Muslims, which is completely wrong, which is completely completely bizarre an argument to make, because nowhere, in fact, the Congress party has been making great efforts to say that we don't even mention the word redistribution in our manifesto. I think they should have. That's my criticism of that manifesto. They should have boldly come ahead and made that argument. And what the problem now is that the Congress party is on a back foot. It has basically said nothing about redistribution in their manifesto, yet it is getting a lot of brickbats on that matter. And now comes the inheritance tax issue, which is a suggestion by Sam Pitroda, who lives outside India. And now they are one more step behind in sort of addressing this question. They are not boldly saying that what's wrong, let's talk about it, but they are essentially saying that no, we will not have inheritance tax in India. So essentially everybody has fallen into that trap, and the prime minister has killed that proposal, the Congress party has killed that proposal, and I think we are in a very unfortunate situation whereby a reasonable discussion on the inheritance tax has been completely sabotaged by the political class.
So, what you're saying is that this could have been, in fact, a tool to address the economic inequality, and the middle class and the poor could have actually benefited if these taxes were implemented?
Look, across the world, the reason why an inheritance tax or a wealth tax is introduced is one, to redistribute wealth in the society. If you look at Western societies, they would argue that about 40% to 60% of the total private wealth in those countries is inherited from their parents. So, as a result, they think that the absence of an inheritance tax or the absence of a wealth tax, essentially what it does is it denies a very important equality of opportunity to all. Some people have a head start over others, which the others do not have. So essentially, if you look at the example that I mentioned elsewhere, if you actually compare the example of the project called Vantara in India, which is essentially an Ambani family venture. Once Mukesh Ambani passes away, the Vantara project is completely going to be the son's, right? And he's not going to pay any money to inherit that property in any form. It has got 3,000 acres, hundreds of animals, 2,000 employees or more, and none of that will be charged any inheritance tax in India. We are used to something like, as I say sometimes, Bab Kamal. We get our father's property for free. We are used to that kind of a system in India. So we are shocked by any proposal that says, oh, I'm inheriting my father's property, I should pay a tax on it. It's a that's how it's met with a kind of a shock in India. Whereas in Western capitalist world, it's very normal. If you look at UK, I gave the example of the Blencathra Peak, which was put out for sale by the Earl of Lonsdale, which was he was trying to sell it for close to 1.75 million British pounds, and he was doing that because his father had passed away, and he had to pay an inheritance tax to the British government of close to 9 million British pounds. And that 9 million British pounds had to be found. Otherwise, he would not be able to inherit the estate of his father. So that was the reason why he put out a Turner painting for sale to the Tate Gallery. He sold a farm for about 2 million pounds, and he also sold this mountain for 2 million pounds. In South Korea, if you go, you have an inheritance tax of 50%, as opposed to the UK, which has a 40% inheritance tax, which this Earl had to pay. Now, in South Korea, the rumor goes, I don't know how true this story is, when the chairman of the Samsung Group, Mr. Lee Kun-hee, died in 2014, the story that went around was that the ventilator support for him was not being taken off for a long time because the air was not prepared to pay a huge inheritance tax of close to 5 billion US dollars to the South Korean government. So these are very normal things that happen in the Western capitalist world or the Eastern capitalist world. Why are we in India suddenly shocked by the idea that you have to pay something to inherit what your father has earned or mother has earned during his or her lifetime? That's because we are used to enjoying what is unearned by us. What is earned by us need not be paid any such tax, but what is unearned by us has to be paid a tax. That is a principle that is applied here. So, number one, inheritance tax helps you to redistribute wealth in the society, particularly when inequality levels are very high. Secondly, inheritance taxes allow you to address certain problems in the society, such as the absence of equality of opportunity, the sort of the idea that only what you earned in your lifetime must be available to you without paying a tax like this. In fact, the whole idea is the job of a father is to educate the children, bring them up, maybe help them in multiple ways. But what the father earned as wealth during his lifetime, that right that he has over that property, that absolute right he has over that private property, ends by the time the father dies. After the death, there is no surety in any Western capitalist world that that property goes to the son or daughter for free. One has to pay for what you do not earn. That is a principle that is applied in those countries. That is why the Earl had to pay such a huge tax. That's why Samsung's children had to pay such huge tax. That's the normal way. But in India, we meet it with a shock because sometimes the problem is that we are used to a system whereby we inherit it for free, and we are suddenly shocked by the idea that we have to pay for it. And mind it, I want to highlight this once again, that only the real top cream would pay this tax. The middle class won't pay, the poor won't pay. Nobody's Mangal Sutra is being lost. In fact, many Mangal Sutras were lost after demonetization, but no Mangal Sutra will be lost by inheritance tax. That's for sure.
Now, can we look at a couple of countries where these taxes are implemented, maybe France or some other country, and see how it can bring down inequality? Let's just compare and then maybe take a look.
In fact, Thomas Piketty, in his work on inequality, says there are two big financial innovations in the 20th century. He says the first big financial innovation in the 20th century is the progressive income tax. And the second biggest financial innovation is a progressive inheritance tax or an estate tax. It's a very interesting point that he makes, because if you look at France, which was one of the first countries to adopt such a measure, it did so after the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, the idea in France was that the son will succeed the father, and it is something that was seen as sacred in some sense. But the coming in of modernity, the coming in of the ideas of the French Revolution, etc., essentially changed this kind of a tradition completely. And it was argued that we need something like an estate or inheritance tax in France also. At that point in France, there were debates. It was argued that France was an equal country. France had land redistribution after the French Revolution. It had equality before law. It had property rights. It had free contracts. So why do we need estate tax or inheritance tax? That was the idea, that was a criticism raised at that point of time. Yet, by consensus, the inheritance tax and the wealth tax were implemented in French society. What difference did it make? You compare, Piketty himself compares France and Germany. He says Germany had an inheritance tax of close to 15 or 20% only, while France had an inheritance tax of close to 40%. As a result, German inequality levels remain much higher than French inequality levels for an extended period of time. And that is probably true even today. So, inheritance taxes or wealth taxes enormously help in reducing inequality levels in the society, particularly in today's times when inequality levels are soaring. The top 1% and their share in the national wealth is increasing significantly. We need something like inheritance tax or wealth tax. That is true for most countries of the world, as I said earlier. Look at, for example, Japan. Japan has a 55% top inheritance tax rate. It's a graded tax, so I'm talking about the top rate. If you look at Japan, it's 55%. If you look at South Korea, it is 50%. If you look at France, it is 45%. United Kingdom 40%, Spain 34%, Ireland 33%, Belgium 30%, Germany 30%, Chile 25%. These are the top inheritance tax rates that are prevalent in the advanced capitalist world. We want to be a capitalist country. That's what a lot of people say. Nirmala Sitharaman was saying that we want to be a unique capitalist model. We want to be a capitalist model, but you will not have the progressive taxation system that most capitalist countries have. That's like wanting to have the cake and eat it too. It doesn't usually happen at all. You can't do both together. So, if you want to be an advanced capitalist country, you want to look like one, you want to become a high income developed country by 2047, you better start thinking about these ideas.
But India too is not completely alien to these taxes, right? Because starting 1951 till they were abolished in 1986 under Rajiv Gandhi, wealth tax, death tax in different forms, gift tax even, did exist. Can you tell us in what forms they existed and why they were abolished finally?
Look, from about 1951, India had different types of taxes in this regard. It had an inheritance tax, it had a wealth tax, it had a gift tax, and so on. But remember, this was the time when India was a poor country. Inequality levels were high in certain respects because if you look at rural areas, there was no land reform to speak about in the rural areas. So land inequalities were high. And this was indeed the case. But in urban areas, if you see, we had not our industrial sector was largely based in the private sector public sector. The private sector industry had not begun to grow in the ways that it today has. Our financial sector or the other forms of services sector, construction sector, etc., also had not boomed like it did in the last 2 or 3 decades. So overall inequality levels in India were under check during the period that we are talking about between 1950s and 1980s or so. So there was economic growth, there was some amount of industrial growth, and so on, but this was not adequate enough to generate the kind of inequalities that we have in the period after liberalization in 1991. So while we had estate tax, gift tax, inheritance tax, etc., this did not fetch adequate amount of tax revenues to the government. If you look at it as a share of gross tax revenue, the share that came from these taxes was probably less than 1%, and that is often the reason cited for its abolishment. It was also cited that the administrative costs for collecting these taxes are very high. And for all these reasons, it was thought of as appropriate in the 1980s to abolish it, particularly because we had economic liberalization in the offing, and there was enormous pressure from the rich to take out this tax, and it was done to by succumbing to that pressure. But that is not the situation today. If you look at it today, inequality levels in India are very high. If you look at the recent study by Lucas Chancel, Nalin Bharti, Thomas Piketty, and Anmol Sumanchi, which was published in 2024, it essentially tells you that the income share of the bottom 50% was about 23% in the national income in the early 1980s, but today it has shrunk from 23% to just 15%. Right? Similarly, the middle class has also suffered. Their income share, that is the middle 40%, so to say, their income share was about 46% in the early 1980s. Today, it is about 28% only. So the bottom 50%, their share has shrunk in the national income. The middle 40%, their share has also shrunk in the national income. Whose share has increased? Let us look at the top 0.1%. The income share of the top 0.1% was about 30% in the early 1980s. Today, it is 57%. Right? Income share of the top 1%. I just said 0.1%. Let's take 1%. That was about 6% in the early 1980s. Today, it is close to about 23%. Right? If you look at, for all these categories, if you see, there is an extraordinary increase in the share that they have in the national income. This rise of inequality that you have in the last 20 or 30 years in India is unprecedented. You did not have this between 1950s and 1980s. Today, you have very vulgar levels of inequality. You have the number of billionaires in India soaring. every year, you have such inequality rising. And it also remains true that the foundational reason behind much of this inequality that we have in India are the ownership of land, ownership of buildings, and the ownership of specific types of financial assets and savings. These are the reasons why you have these high levels of inequality in India today. And this essentially translates to the inference that it is the right time to think about a tax which would help you to tap this as a tax revenue source, to tap this as a tool to address this kind of vulgar rise in inequality, and to have some amount of redistribution of wealth in the society. I think there is nothing wrong in thinking about uh, uh, wealth tax, or an inheritance tax in India. Studies have actually shown that this can fetch you significant amounts of income today, and I think it's just apt that we start thinking about this proposal seriously.
Now, you say that these taxes are the need of the hour for a country like India, but the fact that Prime Minister Modi, Nirmala Sitharaman, and a whole bunch of BJP leaders have stigmatized these taxes, can we ever have a reasonable and a nuanced conversation on these things now?
Unfortunately, Pooja, the kind of vitriolic response of the prime minister and his members in his cabinet or party have essentially killed the space for this debate for quite a period of time, I suppose. Any debate on or any discussion on the inheritance tax or wealth tax will be given a spin by the BJP or the government in power to argue that this is of this redistribution that is being thought of is of a particular kind. It is being given to a particular community to the exclusion of another community. It is being implemented on the poor and the middle class. All these lies and canards are being spread about inheritance tax and wealth tax, which essentially has destroyed the space of reasonable debate that must exist on such important matters. Economists cannot anymore discuss this without being worried about the kind of spin that the policymakers or a section of the government might give to their proposal. And that's one of the biggest harms done to this debate by this kind of response of the prime minister. It's very unfortunate. In fact, uh, I'll just say something additionally here. In addition to what I earlier said, if you actually look at some of the work that has happened on wealth tax and inheritance tax in India, I will just cite a study for the benefit of the viewers here, which is a study by Prabhat Patnaik and Jayati Ghosh, which they attempted last year, where they actually argue that a poor country like India, a highly unequal country like India, needs focus on five rights. And that's the kind of debate that they want to enter into to sort of create some space for a reasonable discussion here. They say that we must have right to employment, right to food, right to pensions for the elderly, right to education, and right to health. And they make a detailed calculation in this regard. And they actually argue that the additional expenditure that would be required to give 100 days of employment to all the needy in the rural and urban areas, to give 10 kg per person of food grains to everybody in India, to provide additional 2% allocation of the GDP in education, an additional 2% allocation of the GDP in health, and to provide all the elderly, about 13 crore elderly in India, with rupees 3,000 per month pension. If you consider all this as a package which would form a comprehensive social security net for the poor, the amount additionally that would be required for the exchequer would be close to 17 lakh crore rupees. Now, if you, but this is not just this is not to be seen in a one-sided form, because the government is incurring this kind of expenditure. You can actually assume certain multiplier effects and assume that there will be a certain economic growth that will follow from this, and a certain tax revenue that would accrue back to the government in the form of higher tax revenues, and that would be close to 5 lakh crore rupees. So you can deduct this 17 lakh crore rupees, you can deduct 5 lakh crore rupees from the 17 lakh crore rupees, and the additional expenditure required would be close to 12 lakh crore rupees. Now, how do we generate these 12 lakh crore rupees is the question that they next go into. They actually argue that the total private net worth of private individuals in India, this was the figure in 2018, this total private net worth was about 570 lakh crore rupees. Just imagine, 570 lakh crore rupees, right? Out of that, what was the share of the top 1% of the private individuals? We are not talking about the middle class. We are not talking about the poor. Just the top 1%, their share was 58%. 58% of this 570 lakh crore rupees is only 330 lakh crore rupees. Now, this is the total private net wealth that you have. Now, can we charge a 2% wealth tax on this amount? If you charge a 2% wealth tax, which will be paid annually on this wealth every year, you get close to 6.6 lakh crore rupees from this top 1%. Remember, you charge this wealth tax of 2% only on the top 1%, right? You get about 6.6 lakh crore rupees back. You also tax about 33% inheritance tax. A 33% inheritance tax, again on the top 1%, will fetch you close to 5.5 lakh crore rupees, according to their calculations. So essentially, you get about 12 lakh crore rupees if you have a 2% wealth tax and a 33% inheritance tax on just the top 1% of private individuals in India, which can finance completely a comprehensive social security net for the India's poor, which covers employment, food, education, health, and pensions. This is how a welfare state must essentially perform. Thomas Piketty calls it a social state in his work, which is different for him from welfare state. But however you look at it, whether a social state or a welfare state, what comes out very clearly that if you tap, as your per capita incomes grow, as your income inequalities are growing, governments will need to take measures to tap that higher wealth or income that the rich and the super rich get. You can actually tap that source using wealth tax and inheritance tax. That's what economies across the world have done in the past and are continuing to do now. And this way, you can actually create redistribution of wealth. Number one, you can generate enough tax revenues to take care of your social security expenses, and you can also create certain equality of opportunity in the society, whereby those with what I call earlier as Bap Kamal do not have an unfair head start over those who do not have the luxury of that Bap Kamal. I think it's just appropriate, again, I must say, that we must have a wealth tax and inheritance tax in India. And what the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have done is an unpardonable error. They have killed the debate by distorting it completely to suit their narrow political means. I can just say it's very unfortunate.
Well, I thank you for this engaging conversation. I think it's very important that economists like yourselves clear up the air when there's so much of rumor mongering and fake news being spread by those in power even. But, for those of us who have joined us today, a quick request that if you want us to continue sane journalism like this, become a TNM subscriber and also contribute to our election fund. And, so that we can bring more voices like Professor Ramakumar and also bring you voices from the ground. Thank you for watching.
This election season, your right to choose puts you at the heart of it again.
We'd like to be your eyes and ears.
Choose the journalism and media that serves democracy and you.
Simply log on to newslaundry.com/2024 election fund and choose an amount of your choice for the reports of your choice.